at the time of filming this, I have spent, I feel like a marathon watching tier ranking videos of people ranking the second half of their year, Pete, and all of their 2024 reads, StoryTube. And I figured, why not just do mine now? Why not just rip the band-aid off instead of kicking that can down the road? So, without any further ado, let's get into it. Almost same tiers as last time. I did change the name of the mind-blowing tier to a new part of my personality because I felt like that was more appropriate for what that tier actually means. We'll see if I'm more selective about what I put there. I don't know. We'll find out. First book that I read, so this is the second half of 2024, so this is going from July 1st to December 31st. So the first book that I finished in July was Lords of Uncreation by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Excuse me, I just downed hot cocoa. And Lords of Uncreation is the last book of the Final Architecture trilogy. It might have taken literally months to be able to discuss the book, but I did discuss it with Pete, and Anitha, and Mike, and I think Kim as well. Either way, I will put the link to that discussion in the description down below. But I really, really liked this trilogy. This was the first experience I had with Adrian Tchaikovsky's science fiction. And I love, apparently, Motley Cruise now, or at least the way that Adrian Tchaikovsky does it. And the aspects that I was intrigued by in the first book, which is Shards of Earth, the elements that I liked in that book, that I adored because it was being expanded upon in Eyes of the Void, that was definitely there in the last book. But I think he married the action and the overall plot with the kind of thematic depth that I enjoyed. That was the focus in Eyes of the Void. So, yeah. So with that said, I will actually put it as a nope. We'll put it as a new favorite. So cool. All right. And then I read Guards, which is the first book in the City Watch subseries of Discworld by Terry Pratchett. And I previously read Equal Rights and Mort, and I figured, you know what, I'm going to read Guards as the first book in the City Watch series, subseries. And I actually wound up doing a discussion with Alan and Kim and Derry about those three books, just discussing my experience with the books as a new Discworld reader, with these three people who are essentially Discworld aficionados, experts, whatever you want to call it. And again, I will leave a link in the description down below to that discussion. So I really, really liked it. Yeah, so I would put it in. I would actually. Alan, please don't hurt me. Derry, please don't hurt me. Kim, please don't hurt me. I would actually just put it in glad I read it. Even though I gave 5 stars, I'd put it in glad I read it. Yeah, so don't worry. Other City Watch books will be higher. Yeah, so, and then I reread Persuasion. So I reread Persuasion. And then I read the penultimate book of the Black Company series by Glenn Cook, Water Sleeps. And I loved this book. Up until that point, Bleak Seasons was my favorite Black Company book. And then I read Water Sleeps, and it easily and immediately surpassed Bleak Seasons for me. I love the narrator. I love the story itself, the plot, and the execution of the story. Considering it is the 9th book in a series, I really can't say anything other than that it continues to follow the Black Company. So I will put it as, yeah, I'm gonna put it actually above Lords of Creation. And then I finished out the Indian Lake trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones with The Angel of Indian Lake. And this is a very dark book, especially in comparison to the first book, My Heart is a Chainsaw, and the second book, Don't Fear the Reaper. If I had to rank the books in the trilogy, I would still say My Heart is a Chainsaw is my favorite, and then The Angel of Indian Lake very closely behind, and then Don't Fear the Reaper. The payoff and satisfaction, and it's kind of satisfaction of the ending of this trilogy is just really, really, really well done. And I think this was Stephen Graham Jones's only series, if I remember correctly, at least so far. And if if everyone can write series the way he does, where each book is so satisfactory and there's this overarching like payoff to it, it's so good. It's so good. Stephen Graham Jones, with every book that I read by him, he just further solidifies himself as one of my favorite writers of all time. And I adored this book. So I would put it up on, I'd actually put it above here. Yeah, I put it there. All right. And then the next book that I read was Kingdom Kongs by Yuri Herrera, translated by Lisa Dillman, I think. So I previously had read a narrative nonfiction by Yuri Herrera a couple of years ago called A Silent Fury, The El Bordo Mine Fires, if I remember the like subtext to it or subtitle. So I just the way that was written, and again it was actually the same translator that translated that work. Just the way that it was written, that he made a nonfiction narrative so compelling, I was really, really interested to read his fiction. So I read Kingdom Kongs, and I feel like I'm saying that word wrong. Kingdom Kongs? Kingdom Kongs? Kingdom Kongs. Kingdom Kongs. There we go. Yeah, anyways, so I read Kingdom Kongs, and it is very short. It's like 100 pages, if that. And it is it's actually crime fiction about like a crime family in Mexico, if I recall correctly. But it's a fable, like no one has a name. They just have their, like, the main character, the protagonist is just a title. And yeah, it's really interesting, really cool. I would put it as glad I read it. I would actually, again, please don't kill me, I would put it above Guards. So, all right. And then I read Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Everything that I'd heard about the Earthseed series is that, she tells the future, and yada 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 yada. So I went into it knowing that I have to mentally prepare myself, because Octavia E. Butler, her storytelling, regardless of what it is and what it's about, she's very hard hitting in her storytelling. And I just feel like I have to be in a appropriate headspace to be able to consume the story that she's telling, because she's very, very, it's very bleak. But yeah, she's not graphic at the same time. I don't know how to describe her writing other than that it's very distinctive, and I like the way, and I actually love the way that she writes, and that she has written. So previously I read the Xenogenesis trilogy, which starts with the Dawn. I also read Kindred, And then I need to read the rest of her work. So, anyways, Parable of the Sower, though, my book of the year. Like, spoiler alert for 2024, this was my favorite book of the year. And I will not, and I cannot shut up about this book. It's incredible the way that she combines the story, the world, thematic elements, and one thing that I didn't expect is that this is a novel written in journal entries from the main character of Lauren, and Lauren is a character who is the founder of this Earth Seed religion. And in each chapter, you get epigraphs from the Earthseed religious texts. And it's just really, if a book was written for me, this would be it, because I love apparently epistolary journal type stories. I love religion and philosophy in fiction. And apparently I just really like the kind of bleak aspect of this world. And even though it's really, really hard to read, my appreciation and adoration for this novel knows no bounds. And then I followed that up with Soldiers Live, which is the final book of the Black Company series, at least as of right now, because Lies Weeping is set to be released in November. But anyways, Soldiers Live is, as of right now, the final book in the Black Company, and the way that Adrian Tchaikovsky and Stephen Graham Jones paid off the end of their respective series with their books, Glenn Cook, he made Soldiers Live is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. Like, beautiful endings to a series, and I'm actually currently rereading Black Company slowly but surely in preparation for Lies Weeping. So I'm currently in the midst of the first book, The Black Company, but Soldiers Live is truly beautiful in story and execution, in character work, and it felt so emotional saying goodbye to all of these characters, reading their stories for the first time, and reading The Black Company for the first time. It's the same way that I felt about when I finished The Realm of the Elderlings. Is like, you've spent so much time with this story, with this world, with these characters, that you can't help but be emotional that it's coming to an end for the first time. And yeah, it is fantastic. I love The Black Company. Apparently people are surprised that that is the case, but I love it. I love The Black Company. And yeah, I can't say anything else. All right, next, I read Titus Alone by Mervyn Peake, which is the third book in the Gormenghast series. I read Titus Alone and Titus Awakes with Marianne Guevara, and I actually did discussions of each book with her, because she was reading the first two books. I had already read them, so I did discussions of those each books as she read them. And then we read Titus Alone and Titus Awakes together, and we did discussions of each of those books once we finished. So, anyways, Titus Alone. It is so different from Titus Grown and Gormenghast, so I understand why people kind of just read the first two books as their own thing and don't continue, or at the very least, why those first two books are rated so highly in comparison to Titus Alone. Titus Alone feels not only unfinished, but it feels completely different. Mervyn Peake was going through, uh, as he was writing it, he was going through uh, medical issues that was, I think, if I recall correctly, undiagnosed at the time. And that really shows in the lack of depth, or lack of, I don't know, just the difference that the very noted difference between Titus Grown and Gormenghast and Titus alone. But with that said, I really, really appreciate it. Especially looking at the Gormenghast series as a whole. I definitely appreciate it a lot more than when I initially read it. And yeah, I really want to read more of Mervyn Peake's bibliography. With that said, I will actually put it as glad I read it. Yeah, yeah. And then I reread The Mad Ship. So Mad Ship is the second book of the Live Ship Traders trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. And The Mad Ship is one of the specific books that I was looking forward to rereading and seeing if I appreciated more, not only on reread, but in context of the whole series. And I'm happy to say that I did love it more on reread. I mean, it was 5 stars originally, so that's not saying much, but I got even more out of it on reread. But yeah, since it was a reread, I'm gonna put it here, just in chronological order of my rereads. Okay. And then, like I said before, I actually buddy read Titus Awakes as well with Marianne, and we did a discussion. Again, I'll leave it linked down below. And this was written by Mervyn Peake's wife, Maeve Gilmore, based on a fragment by Mervyn Peake. And this actually, I thought that this was published like by Maeve Gilmore, but it turns out that it actually wasn't found until decades after Maeve Gilmore's death. And her kids or grandkids published it in the past like 10 years or so. And the fragment written by Mervyn Peake is the first chapter in Titus Awakes. And you, even more so than in Titus alone, you can see the incredibly marked mental decline of Mervyn Peake. And reading Titus Awakes, reading what Maeve Gilmore created, not only as an homage to Titus grown as a character and the Gormenghast series as a series, but also to Mervyn Peake, not only as an author, but also as her husband. It's an incredibly emotional read. And I think it's one of the most beautiful books when you take all of that into account and into context. Is it the best written book? Is it the best story ever? No. But I think there's so much worth to a novel when it has such an emotional connection and catharsis for you, regardless of how well it might have been written. So with that said, I'm going to put this as indicative of the series as a whole. This is part of my personality. I would say, like, I read the entire series of Gormenghast this year, so I would just say it just edges out Black Company, oddly enough. But only just. But again, these are tiers. Like, these are all part of my personality. Okay. All right. The next book that I read was the second City Watch book, Men-at-Arms by Terry Pratchett. And Guards, I really appreciated, really liked, obviously, because otherwise I wouldn't have continued on with the series. However, Men-at-Arms is the one where I realized, oh, I love this sub-series now. I love these characters. I already had loved Carrot before, but I really loved Carrot in this one. And I loved Angua and I love detritus and cubby, and I really love it. So I'm going to put it as here. Yeah, I'm gonna put it right there. All right. Next book that I read was Toad by Catherine Dunn. This is a quote-unquote hot girl book, and it is a book that is about a woman who is reflecting on her friend group that she had in college in the 60s, and it is written in a dual, not a dual perspective, but alternating chapters of where she's reflecting on her current, like, present state, and then she's reflecting on, like, past scenes, like telling the stories of that past, with her friends. It's, as apparently the unofficial definition of hot girl fiction goes, it is disgusting. And again, especially since this was written in the 60s, 70s, or whatever, even by modern standards, it's disgusting. And I would say that I am very glad that I read it. With that said, I did listen to it. I immersion read it because I think that helped me get through those chapters where she's actually telling the stories with her about where, those instances and incidents with her friends. It was just very much a set so firmly in a particular time and place that I struggled with connecting with those scenes. So having the audiobook helped me kind of, I don't want to say get through it, but like get momentum, was beneficial. And then the next book that I read was The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. And this book I actually read as part of the Alexandria book club that the patrons of Alan from the Library of Alexandria, we took it upon ourselves to create a book club, in shameless imitation of Jimmy from the Fantasy Network's patron book club. And this is seriously, are you gonna move? Thank you. Yes, anyways, sorry. And this was the first book that I had read for the book club, actually, because I think it was the first one, because I tried the other ones because it started in July. June, July. Yeah, no, it started in July, and I just didn't click with the picks there. So I didn't read them. But The King of Elfland's Daughter, I absolutely adored. My reputation of loving sad books and loving melancholy art, is not helped with The King of Elfland's Daughter, because it is melancholia through and through. I was riding a real big high after I read this book. But with that said, I will actually put it as glad I read it. Because I'm very, very glad I read it, like on the verge of new favorite. So only because as time has gone on, I don't remember much of the plot. I remember just my feeling so emotionally connected to it, and just the whole, I don't know, catharsis of it. But anyways, and then I read The Book of Magic, which is an anthology edited by Gardner Dozois, whatever. And technically, I read about a little under half of this last year. Not, and by last year, I mean 2023, for the short story September thing that I host. And I finished the rest of it this year. And as anthologies go, you have a bunch of different authors contributing. Some were poopers, and some were great, and a lot was middlings. With that said, I think that it for sure goes into ambivalent. I was not indifferent, because there were some stories in there that I absolutely adored. The George R. R. Martin story, that was a Jack Vance Dying Earth story, made me incredibly interested in not only the George R. R. Martin's works in general and his writing in general, but also Jack Vance's Dying Earth series because I loved the world itself. Scott Lynch's story in there has stuck with me ever since I read it, and I his writing was beautiful, and just the story itself was really really impactful. So I'm really intrigued to read more of Scott Lynch's works. There was a Robin Hobb story in there that I technically read in 2023, but I really loved that. Um, yeah, and there were some other stories in there that I, not off the top of my head, I can't quite. But yeah, anyways, whatever. I would definitely recommend it because as with the anthologies, you're going to win some, lose some. So, all right, the next one that I read was Soulless. This was part of the romance book care package that Sal from Alan's Discord sent me because she's trying her darndest to get me into romance, and unfortunately Soulless did not work. It didn't make me a romance reader. Only Emily Henry does that for me. So even though I didn't rate this on Goodreads, I didn't rate it anywhere. I'm gonna have to rank it. I'm so sorry, Sal. I'm so sorry. I do see its appeal. It's just it wasn't for me. All right, the next book that I read was The Long Valley by John Steinbeck. This is a collection of short stories that I technically read with Carlos from StoryTube, but I think I dusted him for sure on this. But I really liked this. It's John Steinbeck, and yeah, John Steinbeck's writing is I would read his grocery lists. And I'm sure there's probably something out there that has published his grocery list. So I would read it. So I would definitely say it's a new favorite. Yeah, new favorite. Because there's the red ponies in there, even though I read that separately. My favorite story of the bunch is The White Quail, but all of the stories have such thematic depth to them, which is indicative of John Steinbeck's storytelling and his craft, that he can do stories, novellas, epics. Yeah, I love everything he writes, which, spoiler alert, he even writes great journals. Then the next book I read was another reread, and I finished out the Life Ship Traders trilogy with Ship of Destiny. And Ship of Destiny went actually down in rating for me by half a star on reread. The end of Ship of Destiny was really difficult to read, not only in content, but in execution. It just seemed very, not only rushed, but everyone seemed to be doing caricature-esque things to be able to get to that end goal that Robin Hobb wanted. The end result itself is fine, but the way we got there in those last, probably I'd say 200 pages, was not satisfactory. So, anyways, and then the next book I read was a random, very spur of the moment mood read based actually on Sal. Sal was reading The Lies of the Ajungo, or she had read them by, oh god, I can't read. Moses Osei Otumi, I think, is his name and how you pronounce it. But they're short novellas. It's a short novella series, and she had been really praising them. She had mentioned that I would probably like them because it's very melancholy and sad, because I have a reputation to uphold and reinforce. So I was able to get a copy from my library, and I read The Lies of the Ajungo, and I really liked it. It's a very short novella, and it's almost fable-like, but not quite. I don't know what the definition of a fable is, but it's a very tight narrative, very purposeful. The writing is serving the story in such an incredible way, making it very atmospheric while smooth and almost dreamlike in a way. And I really, really liked it. I actually need to continue and read the second, and I think the third book is out now, or maybe it comes out this year. I can't remember. But either way, I need to continue with the series. So I'm very glad that I read it. Yeah, right there. And then the next book I read was Perfume, The Story of a Murderer by Patrick Suskind. And I have been meaning to read this book for at least 10 years because actually maybe even 15 years, because I watched the film adaptation, not realizing that it was based on a book. Loved the film. If I rewatched it now, I probably wouldn't like it nearly as much, but Ben Whishaw is in it, and I freaking love Ben Whishaw. The book itself, though, I absolutely adored it. The way that Patrick Suskind is able to write narrative, and shout out to the translator because I don't read German. The way that Patrick Suskind and the translator was able to successfully convey the literal sense of smell and the sense of everything through words. Like I am not a sensory reader. I am not a visual reader. I don't immerse myself in stories in that way, but what Suskind was able to do with evoking these floral scents, these disgusting scents, this sense of decay, and it's just was so well done. And the story itself is incredibly gross but beautiful to read because of this almost immersive quality through the sense of smell. And it's the story of a murderer, so what do you expect? Another thing that I just want to say about this book is that I really love the way that Suskind framed the book, in that this is a story set in the 1700s of France, and it reads like writing from that time, but in a accessible way, if that makes sense. And I just really, really loved this entire experience. And this is another book that I'm pretty sure I dusted my buddy reader on. I'm so sorry, Yolanda. But we both enjoyed it. So I would say I'm very, very, very glad I read it. I would actually say I liked it a tad bit more than King of Offline's Daughter. And then the next book I read was A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez. This is her latest book that came out, and it is a collection of short stories translated by Megan McDowell. And I absolutely adored this book. This is my favorite book by Enriquez. This collection is like the most witchy, gothic horror of Enriquez's collections. And the two stories at the end, in particular, truly and utterly terrified me. I was reading one in broad daylight and I was still absolutely terrified. And then the other one, I had nightmares that night when I slept. So it was really good. So I would definitely put it as part of my personality because I freaking love this book. And I will read anything and everything Mariana Enriquez puts out and is translated to English. You will see in a moment or two that the last book that I had to read from her didn't work quite as well, but regardless, I'm still still want to have it known that I still want to read everything that she writes, because I think she's an incredible, incredible writer. And the next book that I read was the third book in the City Watch subseries, Feet of Clay. So at the time that I read this, it was my lowest rated City Watch book. It was 4.5 stars in comparison to the rest being 5 stars. And the only reason that it was 4.5 stars is because I recognized an element that is apparently going to be a common theme in the City Watch books, and it really, really frustrated me. In hindsight, I appreciate this book so much more because I have continued on in the City Watch books past this book, and those elements are still there, still happening. I think because I recognized it in this book, I'm not surprised about it going forward because I know what to expect. So, retroactively and in hindsight, Feet of Clay is just increasing in my enjoyment. So, I would say that Feet of Clay is definitely a new favorite as well. I love Dorful. I love Dorful so much. Ugh, I love Dorful. I hope Dorful is in more of the City Watch books and Discworld in general. The next book that I read was Severed Echoes by Anya Dillon. The first and only self-published book that I've read ever. So, I have a vlog of this, and I will leave a link to all the stuff that I mentioned down below. And I loved this book. I was surprised by this book. I was consumed by this book. I need the second book now. And just and I'm not saying this like I don't know. As an aside, yes, I'm friends with Amanda / Anya Dillon. I'm friends with the author. This does not in any way like my experience with the book is my experience with the book, regardless of whether I know the author or not. Yeah, I cannot stop thinking about this book. And I adored it. There's no question. There's no question. It's a part of my personality. There are very few times that I'm so consumed by a book and it just takes over. And I adored it. I adored every single thing about it. So, yeah. So, thank you, Anya Dillon. Book 2, please. All right, next book that I read was actually a collection of poetry. I've read every single thing written by Sarah Tolmie at this point, except for her poetry. And I reached out to Matt and I said, hey, you feeling some poetry? Because he's my dedicated Sarah Tolmie buddy reader. And he's like, let's do it. So we read Trio, which was her first published collection of poems. And this is her version of sonnets. And no shade, but also all of the shade to modern poetry. Like, this is the type of modern poetry that I want, where there's actual craft and skill to it, rather than just Instagram poetry. Like, I don't understand most modern poetry. I don't get it. But Sarah Tolmie with Trio, these are sonnets, these are modern day sonnets, and there is rhyme and meter, and it's just great. And as sonnets, they are about love and all the varieties of love, the passion of love, the physicality of love, and I really, 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 really liked it. And it's Sarah Tolmie. Sarah Tolmie is one of my favorite authors of all time. And spoiler alert, I have read everything by her, including all of her poetry. So I would say I am very, very glad I read it. All right, and then I read The Gypsy, which is a co-authored urban fantasy novel written by Stephen Bruce and Megan Lindholm, aka Robin Hobb. And I read this with Josh from Red Fury Books. We did a discussion of it, and we were both fairly middling on it. However, I just love experiencing the backlist of favorite authors. With that said, like, I truly don't know who wrote what in The Gypsy because it all flows pretty well, and there's not a clear distinction on who wrote what. To the point that I'm really interested in reading Stephen Bruce and seeing how he writes on his own and seeing if I will enjoy his works. So with that said, I will put this as a middling, the middling tier, which is ambivalent or indifferent, because I was very conflicted about it. All right, next book I read was finally, Kim and I finished the Russian fairy tales, which we have been buddy reading for quite some time. I feel like all year last year we were reading this thing. But we finally finished Russian fairy tales, and it is a collection of, well, Russian fairy tales that was published in the 1800s originally. And it was really nice just reading all the themes and like the commonalities and the frequency of figures and elements throughout Russian folk and fairy tales. So I would very much say that I was glad I read it, and especially reading it with Kim was great. Then the next work that I read was The Art of Dying by Sarah Tolmie. This was her second published collection of poetry, and as the title implies, this is about death and dying. So, of course, I loved this frickin' thing, and this was my favorite of the collections. Spoiler alert for the third one. Again, there's rhyme, there's meter, there is structure and craft to them in the execution of these poems, and I really, really, really liked it. I would say, yeah, I'd say it's a new favorite. I would just because it's such a me poetry collection. And then I finally finished Blackwater by Michael McDowell. I had been slowly reading Blackwater starting, I think, in May or June, maybe July. I can't remember. Either way. But I finally finished it. It is technically 6 short novels, serial novels, but I read the bind up, and this is a masterclass and a masterpiece of modern horror. And by modern, I mean it was published in the 1980s. But it is a Southern Gothic family saga of this family of the Caskies and this woman that comes into their midst, this mysterious woman, and it just follows them over generations. And yeah, it is so good. It's a masterpiece. It's on the verge of being a part of my personality, but only just. So I will put it, I will put it here. All right, and then I read the second and final book in the Earth Seed series by Octavia E. Butler, Parable of the Talents. And this novel is the one where when people say, oh, Butler foretold the future, this is the one that they're talking about. And what I really like about Octavia E. Butler's series is that each novel in her series stands on its own, in that it has a satisfactory story to tell within that book. So Parable of the Sower has a beginning, middle, end that is satisfactory in itself. Parable of the Talents has a beginning, middle, end that is satisfactory in itself. However, what she does in building off what was created in Parable of the Sower, applying that in Parable of the Talents, and then building from there to create that kind of singular story is really, again, just really, really satisfactory. And it's really, really regretful that she unfortunately passed away before she could continue the series. But these two novels on their own, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, are incredibly satisfactory to read. Really enriching, compelling, challenging, just really, really, really incredible. So considering Parable of the Sower is up in my new personality, I mean, even though I put Water Sleeps in new favorite instead of Soldiers Live up there, I gotta put it up there. I gotta put it up there. I got stuff. I really love the Earthseed books. So right after I finished the Earthseed books, I read a very short essay that was actually just recently published. I think it was published in 2024. A few rules for predicting the future. And this has a couple of essays that Butler wrote in response to I guess, something that happened with a student reporter that misquoted her. And it's less than 40 pages. I think it's really worth reading, especially once you've read the Earthseed series, because it is in conversation with that series, as well as just kind of generally talking about her craft and her writing, and what her purpose is as a writer, and what her intent is. So I really, really liked it. So that was my first nonfiction of the second half of the year. And then I read Colors in the Steel, the first book of the Fencer trilogy by K.J. Parker. I read this as part of a read-along on Alan's channel. So I'll just leave a link down below to the discussion that I had with Alan, Anita, and Pete about this book. And yeah, this was the first published book by K.J. Parker as his K.J. Parker pseudonym. And I actually really, really liked it. Parker put, it feels like all of his eggs in one basket in this book and in this series. So you see elements that he plays with and that he pulls out and he expands upon in other books later on in Colors in the Steel on its own, and then also in Belly of the Bow a little bit. Spoiler alert. And I just really love seeing, again, similar to the Gypsy, seeing where authors start from and see what the common themes are and threads are, and it's just really, really cool. I really, really, really liked Colors in the Steel, and so I will say it is definitely I would actually, I mean, this is all subject to change based on my mood, except for probably the Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, and anything in that part of my new personality. I don't know. It's like edging up to new favorite, so I would put edging up to new favorite. And then the next book I read was Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is her novel, her only novel, at least as of right now, translated into English. This is a epic horror family saga. Apparently, I have a thing for family sagas, and I struggled with this. I think because I was so used to her short fiction that reading this very chunky book, even though it's separated into parts, I just really, really struggled with it. I feel like Enriquez is, for me, much more effective in her short fiction. So the only way I was able to get through this was because of an audiobook. So I would say it is ambivalent, indifferent, and I would say it's, yeah, I think that order works. And then I read Jingo, the next book in the City Watch series by Terry Pratchett, and I loved this book. It was fantastic, and it's about international politics in a way, I guess, but Terry Pratchett style, and I loved it. Then I read The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is one of the books that Kyle assigned to me for the Kyle versus Jake TBR assignment thing. So, spoiler alert, I only got through 2 of the 4 so far. My hope is to get through the other 2 relatively soon. The Book Thief, it's a young adult historical fiction book about World War II. But the interesting thing about this is that it's told from a young German girl's perspective, who lives in Nazi Germany. Given the content, it is understandably and unsurprisingly very hard-hitting. With that said, the very end, the epilogue, I actually kind of would have preferred the epilogue not to be there. I understand why it was there, but for me, the emotional effectiveness and catharsis of that last chapter was kind of dulled a little bit by the epilogue. I think it's an important read, and I know Jimmy has said the same thing. So basically, I'm just parroting Jimmy at this point. I will say that as an adult reader, it did take me a while to get used to the writing style, because from the first page, you know that this is a book written from the perspective of death. And there is this almost in and out, like piecemeal quality to the writing as he's going to the main character Liesel, seeing what she's doing, going to the scene with her, moving out, doing like a more kind of outward view and overarching view of Liesel's life, and referring to things that happen in the future but we haven't seen yet on the page. And it just took me a while to get used to that writing style, but once I did, I was in it. And I am very, very, very glad that I read it. I think it's very, very important. Another one that was, it was very, actually, yeah, I'll put it there. Okay. And then I read the last of the Sarah Told Me books that I had to read, which was a poetry collection. This is Check. And it's really about like identity and the kind of check boxes that we make in our lives to say, oh, are we female? What's our race? What's our religion? What's our politics? And she really pushes the boundaries and plays with just expectations of those things through her poetry. And that can actually be a little uncomfortable sometimes to read. At least it was for me, because I couldn't quite tell if she was being serious or satirical at times. I think that's what really she was trying to do, is like make us question that, and to play with those aspects. So yeah, I am definitely glad that I read it. I would say, yeah, I would put it there. And then I next read Nation by Terry Pratchett. This is a non-Discworld book, and it is technically a young adult book, but I think it is a young adult book that, similar to The Book Thief, is applicable to everyone regardless of their age group. And I read this as part of the Library of Alexandria book club, and I just absolutely adored this book. I will leave a link down below to the discussion that I had with Kim and Pete on this book, because I utterly and absolutely adored it. It is my favorite single Terry Pratchett work at this point. I cannot and will not shut up about this book. So I would say yeah, I'd put it right there. And then the next book that I read was Memory and Dream by Charles Dillon. This was Jake's pick, or one of Jake's picks for the Kyle versus Jake TBR assignment thing. And this is a book about art and artists. And there are no redeeming qualities about this book. I genuinely hated it, every single aspect. I understand what Charles Dillon was trying to do. He had great theses about art and the importance of art and the arguments that people have about art, but the story around it was awful, was terrible, was literally unreadable to the point that I had to listen to it on audio. And I genuinely hated it. So it's an abomination. I'm sorry, Jake. All right, and then the next book that I read was I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. I wanted to make sure that I read I Was a Teenage Slasher before the end of 2024 so that I could mark it as still as new since it was published in 2024. And I really, really liked this. It took me a while to get through it because it's actually it's pretty surprisingly emotional. We are, as the title implies, we are following this story, this slasher novel, through the perspective of the slasher themselves. And the way that Stephen Graham Jones uses narrative voice and the way that he plays with narrative voice and through the story is really, really just no one else does it like Stephen Graham Jones, with his ability to play with tropes and norms and perspective to create something new and surprising and fresh while still paying homage and honoring those expectations and established histories of a genre like slashers and in horror. So with that said, I really, 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 really liked it. And it's not my favorite Stephen Graham Jones book. But it is definitely a new favorite of his. I would say it is. I would put it, yeah, since I have it here. Actually, depending upon the day, like you can swap Angel and Indian Lake and I Was a Teenage Slasher for me for last year. All right, and then I finally read Working Days, The Journals of the Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So these are journals that John Steinbeck was writing as he was writing Grapes of Wrath. If you recall from my previous tier ranking video, I read Grapes of Wrath. Loved it. And reading these journals really informed and enriched an already incredible novel. And it was really refreshing to read this literary giant and great who is John Steinbeck, that was still so uncertain about himself. He had misgivings and concerns, and he talked about, he's like, oh, this is gonna be crap. This is the worst thing I've ever written. And to have this canon, this writer of American literary greatness, so have the same uncertainties and kind of imposter like thought processes was oddly refreshing. And again, reading his journals really informs Grapes of Wrath, and seeing how he thinks about his characters and how he planned everything as he was writing them, really, really cool. I really, really liked it, so I would definitely put it here. I'm not gonna rank the nonfiction or rereads as I've done the rest of them with like orders and stuff like that. I'm just gonna do it as I read them. So, all right, and then the next book that I read was a short story by Susanna Clarke, The Wood at Midwinter. This, I think, was a BBC radio play that Clarke had written, but it was published last year in a physical format. And it was a great, sweet, nice read to read in one sitting, especially during colder winter times. And I am glad that I read it. It was in the same world as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but no overt references. And the author's note at the end was actually really, really cool to read. So I would put it. Yeah, I'd put it there. All right. And then sorry Alan, sorry Laura. I read The Odyssey by Homer, specifically Emily Wilson's translation. Again, if you recall from my previous tier ranking video, I read the Iliad in the first half of the year of 2024, and I had started the Odyssey, and I finally got through it all, and I really, really loved it. I still, if I had to choose between the two, I would choose the Iliad over the Odyssey, but I really, really, really like the Odyssey. Apparently, epic poetry is my thing now, and I loved it so much. So I would put it up here if I can get it in the right spot. There you go. Right there. Yep, right there. And then I read Women and Power by Mary Beard. So this is a short collection of 2 essays/speeches that Mary Beard gave regarding, well, women and power, and how these very modern arguments really aren't modern at all, that they've been issues that have been occurring for literally thousands of years. And she goes back to ancient Greco-Roman times to explore and showcase ancient incidents where the same things that are happening now were happening then, and that we still haven't changed all that much, and how much we still need to do going forward to make that change. But I really liked it. Very short read. All right, and then the next book that I finished was the second book in the Fencer trilogy by K.J. Parker, The Belly of the Bow. Even though I liked Colors in the Steel so much, like, I thought that as I was reading Belly of the Bow, I was like, you know what? I like Colors in the Steel more. Once I finished Belly of the Bow, and especially discussing it with Alan and Pete and Anitha, again, I'll leave a link to the discussion in the description. I think Belly of the Bow is the most satisfactory novel, at least of the Fencer trilogy, and maybe even of all of his books so far, other than the Engineer trilogy, because he knows how to build tension. Parker knows how to build tension, and the payoff in Belly of the Bow was so mind-blowingly awesome that it was just great. So I would actually have to put it at, I would say, yeah, I'd put it there. And then I read The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. Similar to I Was a Teenage Slasher, I wanted to make sure I finished this book by the end of 2024 so that I could keep it marked as new since it was published this year. And this is a book that I actually technically DNF'd earlier in 2024. I had a electronic ARC of it, and it was the wrong book, wrong time, and I knew it was a me problem. So coming back to this novel, rereading it, finishing it, really, really loving it was such a relief for me. And this is a historical fantasy set in World War One, and Catherine Arden really uses her narrative voice with both Laura and Freddie's perspectives, these two siblings. One's a nurse, one's a soldier on the front lines and in the trenches of World War One. She uses their narrative voices to explore post-traumatic stress disorder, and even not even post-traumatic, it's just trauma of war, really effectively, and I think it was great. There were some things that I didn't quite jive with. Some narrative choices felt a little off that I felt could have been fleshed out a lot more. But I will say that I'm very glad that I read it. I would say yes, right there. And then the penultimate book that I read that I finished in 2024 is the latest Tyrant Philosopher's book by Adrian Tchaikovsky, Days of Shattered Faith. And I loved City of Last Chances when I read it in 2022. 2022? No, 2023, because I read it in early 2023. And then I read House of Open Wounds, I was thinking, oh, there's no way he can top City of Last Chances, because City of Last Chances was going to be my book of the year of 2023, or at least up there. And then I read House of Open Wounds at the end of 2023 when it came out, and I adored that book, absolutely and utterly adored it. So I was very excited and nervous about Days of Shattered Faith when it was announced. And Adrian Tchaikovsky with Tyrant Philosophers, I feel like he's writing this series just for me. Each book stands on its own, but again, actually similar to Butler, he's writing these stories that stand on their own individually, have their each beginning, middle, end in each book, but he's building off previous books in specifically characters, not just the world, because this is a huge world. He's going to actually different areas of this world, and the common theme is the Palestine sway and their outreach and their attempts to take over the world and spread perfection throughout this world. And there are characters that you meet in City of Last Chances that some trickle over into House of Open Wounds, and then in Days of Shattered Faith you get some characters from City of Last Chances that you haven't seen since then, and then you get some characters in House of Open Wounds that you see in this latest book. And what I really am so impressed by is how he's able to flesh out these characters that previously were relatively primary characters. They're now secondary characters in the subsequent books, and he still builds out and establishes new primary characters in such a satisfying way, juggling all of this. And Days of Shattered Faith is it's gothic, it's creepy, it's horror, but it's also got religion and spirituality and ritualism, and there's a surprising political aspect to it, not just with the Palestine goings on, but you're focusing on this story, or on this world called the Usmai, and the political machinations and goings on within Usmai is really cool. I love Tyrant Philosophers so much. I can't shut up about it. It's definitely part of my personality. And I love it so much. I would say, yeah, I would say it's right there. And then the last book that I read in 2024 is a spur of the moment, unplanned thing. And I'm so glad that I read it. It's A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'd heard murmurings that, oh, Wizard of Earthsea, it's not the best. At least read, Tombs of Atuin. The other books in the series are, get better and better. Wizard of Earthsea is the weakest of the bunch and is not the greatest. So when I read A Wizard of Earthsea, I was blown away with how much I loved it. It was not only the right book at the right time for me, but it is also just, regardless, a wonderful, wonderful book. And I loved what Le Guin was exploring with Ged's character, and that it's a coming of age novel, and that the conflict is less external and more internal as Ged is figuring out how to grow up and deal with the world around him, as he's learning to be a wizard in Earthsea. So I really, 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 really love it. Yeah, definitely gonna be part of my personality. Again, all of these could be turned around, flipped, whatever. Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, so that's my tier ranking. And yeah.